Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. Men and women love to speculate. It becomes a pastime to many, even when there is no possible way for them to know the future. Some major event happens in the world. How will the government respond? Some scandal happens to a politician. Will they be forced to resign? Will they be thrown out of office? Or will they suffer through it and survive politically? The church faces turmoil, either physical or spiritual. What will be done? How will the members react? These are impossible to say in the moment, and so it is simply idle chatter. And then, of course, we have things written to us, some of which is left unsaid. What was left unsaid? People love to speculate, and if we're not careful, those speculations can soon be seen of as truth. When it comes to Scripture, speculation runs rampant in many passages, often veering into things that we do not need to know in order to understand the passage, and at worst, introducing false doctrine into the text. Let's see how that speculation is at work in today's reading. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 2 Corinthians to chapter 12. We're going to be reading from verses 7 to 13. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning at verse 7. And lest I should be exalted above measure, by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I have become a fool in boasting. You have compelled me. For I ought to have been commended by you, for in nothing was I behind the most eminent apostles, though I am nothing. Truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. For what is it in which you were inferior to other churches, except that I myself was not burdensome to you? Forgive me this wrong. Paul has been pillorying the Corinthians for accepting fools gladly, false teachers who claim Paul was a fool, when in fact they were fools for boasting in themselves. Paul spent most of chapter 11 and all of chapter 12 thus far speaking ironically and sarcastically about the fact that if he actually compared himself to these false teachers and boasted the way they boasted, the Corinthians should accept him and reject these false teachers. Of course, the Corinthians should have rejected these false teachers, but for the right reasons, because they were teaching damnable heresies, not because Paul was a better preacher. Earlier in chapter 12, Paul told us about a vision that he experienced where he was taken to heaven and heard inexpressible words that he was not allowed to repeat. These false teachers had not experienced a vision like this, and yet they said Paul wasn't an apostle and wasn't teaching the truth. If this was to be a battle of physical boasting, Paul would win. And even the Lord recognized that such was a possibility for Paul because not everybody received the revelations that Paul did, and certainly not everyone was taken to heaven like Paul was. Having such things happen to them could easily cause one to feel superior to other Christians or better behaving Christians than other Christians, or the one who could teach the gospel the best. And God did not want that to happen, so God allowed Paul to be afflicted by Satan with a thorn in the flesh. Not long from now, we will study the book of Job. And in that book, we will get a peek behind the curtain as to what happens in the spiritual realm, especially as it concerns suffering. When God made this world, there was no pain, suffering, or death. All of those were a result of sin, giving into the temptations of Satan. The scriptures clearly teach us that Satan is our adversary and does continue to get us to sin. However, God does allow Satan to afflict man as well, and he uses those afflictions to humble us and test and strengthen our faith. Now, this doesn't mean that every affliction that we face is of Satan, but let's not discount that some of them may and some of them may be allowed in order to keep us humble. God is not the cause of suffering. but he allows it to exist in this world of sin so that Christians could keep their faith in God and their eyes on the hope of heaven, where none of that will exist. Back in Genesis and Exodus, we asked the question, why did God not just allow Israel to remain in Canaan, and when the time was right, supplant the ruling Canaanites? Why send them off to be slaves in Egypt? We get the answer to that question in Exodus 13, 11 through 16, where we read there, "And it shall be, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers and gives it to you, that you shall set apart to the Lord all that open the womb, that is, every firstborn that comes from an animal which you have, the males shall be the Lord's. But every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. And if you will not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And all the firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. So it shall be, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, What is this? That you shall say to him, By strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And it came to pass, when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all males that open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a sign on your hand and as frontlets between your eyes, for by the strength of the hand of the Lord brought us out of Egypt." In other passages, we also learn that God bringing Israel out of Egypt would be a testament to the nations of his power, but it was also a testament for Israel. Had they received Canaan simply by becoming the greatest people, they wouldn't have learned that their God was benevolent, merciful, and gracious. They wouldn't have learned their need to depend on him for everything. And the same thing goes for the Christian. It's very easy to want to be self-reliant, to be self-made. A true Christian can never be said to be reliant on self for salvation, for God's grace provides that, even though our faith is required. And a true Christian can never said to be self-made, for if we're molded into Christ's image, as a Christian will be, God is the one doing the molding. Paul could have easily become arrogant, and so God allowed Satan to afflict him in order that Paul remain humble. With this being said, what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? Well, since Paul was not talking of a literal thorn, he must have been speaking metaphorically. Some of the more popular theories of the thorn's interpretation include temptation, a chronic eye problem, malaria, migraines, epilepsy, and a speech disability. Some even say that the thorn refers to a person, such as Alexander the coppersmith, who Paul said did him a great deal of harm in 2 Timothy 4:14. No one can say for sure what Paul's thorn in the flesh was, and so it's useless to speculate, but whatever it was a source of real pain in the apostle's life. It was so much pain, in fact, that Paul sought from the Lord 3 times to have it removed. It wasn't removed. Rather, the Lord said to Paul that God's grace was sufficient for Paul, for the Lord's strength is made perfect in weakness. Understanding that God's grace was sufficient to save Paul, even with this thorn in the flesh, is rather easy to understand. But how is the Lord's strength made perfect in weakness? Such seems paradoxical, for the Lord is all-powerful. What is meant is that the strength which God imparts to his people is more commonly and more completely manifested or made known when God's people feel that they are weak. It is not imparted to those who feel that they are strong and who do not realize their need of divine aid. It is not so completely manifested to those who are vigorous and strong as to the feeble. It is when we are conscious that we are feeble and when we feel our need of aid that the Redeemer of mankind manifests his power to uphold and provides us his purest comforts. Could Paul preach the gospel with this thorn in the flesh? Sure he could. And he did so powerfully and effectively. And God's power was seen through Paul's teachings and his actions. And so, Paul didn't boast like others boast, but he did take pleasure in his infirmities, not because they made him a better Christian than others, but because God's power could be seen through them, and Paul could be comforted by God in spite of them. The Corinthians should have easily seen this, and been his letter of commendation, as it were, throwing out these false prophets from among them for slandering Paul. They should have told these false teachers that Paul was truly an apostle of Jesus Christ due to the signs of an apostle among them, which include the power to pass on spiritual gifts, a power exclusive to the apostles on earth. In other words, Paul provided the Corinthians all the evidence they needed to know that Paul was who he said he was. What had Paul done to deserve the type of treatment from some of them? How were they inferior to other churches, unless, of course, they thought they were because Paul didn't take wages from them? They weren't inferior, and Paul, again with a touch of sarcasm, asked for their forgiveness for not taking wages from them. In truth, Paul knew why he didn't do so, for it would have been a stumbling block. And it was his right not to take wages, especially in that situation. That shouldn't have caused the Corinthians to feel inferior, nor have caused them to accept these accusations of the false teachers. They should have known better and should have acted better. Now, for some Christians, being treated this way might cause them to want to stay away. But not Paul. He loved this church, and he wanted to see them again. Not so he could take their money, but so that he could express that love to them. We'll conclude chapter 12 with Paul's thoughts on that, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 14 to 21, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.